the shot, count it down, flip it off. Meet the swinger, Polaroid swinger.
I won't be swinging, mine's an old Polaroid CL635. I was rummaging around in the attic earlier in the month when I found it. It's one of my old cameras. It's a classic Polaroid model and I thought I would give it a go. I think it must be 30 years since I last used this. It was probably manufactured in the late 1980s. I've been having a look and you can still pick these up on eBay second hand for around £30 to £50. In the video description below I've included a link to the manual for the 600 series, but even if a Polaroid you've got lying around or that you decide to buy isn't exactly the same model and you haven't got the manual for it and can't find it online, the functions and whatnot are very similar across different ranges of Polaroids, so you'll be able to figure it out. As far as I know, 600 is the only compatible film for this camera. It operates on a battery and, interestingly, the batteries are in the film cartridges. That powers the camera. A single cartridge like this costs £18 and this is what you get. This one's colour and you have 8 exposures in it as standard, so 8 photographs. It used to be 10 and you'll notice here on the back of the camera you may not be able to see it clearly, but there is a dial that says 10, but you actually only have 8 exposures, and when the dial is down to 2 that means you've run out. This is because the current Polaroid film sheets are slightly thicker than the old Polaroid film sheets. As a result, it's not possible to fit 10 photos in the film cartridge, and they obviously couldn't change the size of the film cartridge because then it wouldn't fit in the camera. The only solution was to put 8 film sheets in each pack instead of 10. £18 for 8 photographs sounds expensive, and it is, but remember that this is an instant camera, so as well as taking the photograph, it also does the developing for you, so you do save some cost. One thing to do when buying any photographic film is to check the expiry date. Factory defects are common. You will get a bad batch now and then. Polaroid film expires pretty quick. What I do is, if I'm not going to load some camera film straight away, then I store it in the fridge. It helps prolong the life of the film, and it also helps minimise any problems with the film when it comes out, such as colour distortion. Also, once you've loaded the film, it's not normally a good idea to try and remove a partially used cartridge if you're new to this, because there's a lot involved in doing that, so don't take it out of the camera unless you really know what you're doing. Just try and use it all within about 2 weeks or so. Each pack should have the production date stamped on it, and the expiration is 1 year after production. If cold stored, it can probably last longer, but there's no intrinsic time limit. The film does expire, and it does it faster at room temperature than in the fridge, so you should probably shoot the pack within 2 weeks, but it will still work if you wait. You might just get some discoloration and then the chemical spread failures that happen to aging film. Now let's take a look some more at the camera itself. The camera has a built-in flash unit that lifts up for picture taking, like so. To lift the flash unit, you should grip the sides of it like this, and then swing the unit back down so it snaps into place. That's when you're not using the camera. The flash is designed in such a way that it should be used for every picture you take with this camera, even if you're outdoors and there's plenty of light. The reason for this is primarily because of the technical limitations of the camera, which I'll be explaining. Polaroid themselves put their own spin on this and say that the flash is configured in such a way that it can sensitively adjust to light and take photographs in pretty much any light conditions, but really it's because the camera is limited. You don't always have to use a flash. As I'll explain, it is possible to take photos with the camera without using the flash. You should load the film cartridge into the camera when the flash unit is raised, and again it's pretty intuitive. All you do is just push this lever here at the side. That opens out the front, then you push the cartridge in. When you do that, a film cover will eject and the counter will be set to 10, though as I've explained, you only have 8 shots in a cartridge, so it does go from 10 to 2. You can see the viewfinder at the front there is not through the lens itself. It's separate, as was typical of those models when they were manufactured, so you do have to allow for that, as what you see through the viewfinder won't necessarily be how the lens sees it, if you see what I mean. It's especially a problem for taking photographs with a Polaroid or other camera with a small focal length. Had a camera taking long range shots, then any distorting effect will perhaps be reduced, but as we're taking shots of things and people relatively close to us, we are vulnerable to a distorting effect known as the parallax error. In simple terms, the parallax effect means that the impression of an object can change dependent on the angle. If you have a separate viewfinder and you're taking a photo of something relatively near, your angle is going to be noticeably different to the lens angle. Why is the camera viewfinder on the left hand side? I'm not entirely sure, but I suspect it's because it's assumed most photographers will be right-handed. So having the viewfinder on the left side puts the controls in a more natural and accessible position for those photographers. The problem for me, of course, is that I'm left-handed. I would be, but I'm used to this sort of thing. Now I'm going to show you the camera's exposure compensation slider. It's just here. You have 3 main settings: light, center and dark, but note that the slider has gradation to it. It works on the spectrum, so to speak, so you can have it, say, halfway between center and light if you want. How it works is that there's a shield in front of the photo cell here that adjusts depending on the light or dark setting, and the camera reads through the screen and adjusts exposure accordingly. It's very obvious and visible if you have the camera. It's typically best to start by positioning it center to let your camera decide which exposure is best. You can then use that as a starting point for trial and error. If your photos consistently come out overexposed in certain conditions, you may want to push the exposure compensation slider some way towards dark. And if a photos consistently come out underexposed in certain conditions, you may want to push it more towards light in those conditions. To be perfectly honest, I don't expect to use this slider much with 600 film, but we'll see. The usefulness of it though is obviously that you can experiment and try photographing the same scene over and over again with different exposures, as a trial and error thing to get used to the camera. The shutter button is right here. It's the red button. You simply push it gently to take a photo. The photo then pops out the front here, and what you should do is hold it by the white border and immediately conceal it from sunlight by putting it in your coat pocket or bag. Pushing the shutter button halfway will charge the flash for about 3 seconds, and the red light will show it's charging. It's pretty intuitive. The light will turn green when the flash is ready to fire, then gently push the button in fully and take the picture. Don't push it too firmly or you'll blur the picture. You don't need to stand ready with the camera to your eye or your finger on the red button while the flash is charging. Once it's charged, and it keeps its charge for several minutes. The sleeve of the red shutter button also has a lip on it, which you can see just here, and that's designed so you can push only that part in and that will take a picture without a flash. Polaroid themselves call this the flash override button, but they say you should use it only in special conditions such as shooting metallic or shiny surfaces or when shooting a subject through glass. The flash also charges when you take a photo, and it charges if you fold the flash unit back down like this. Then lift it up. Then it also charges if you lift it up again. It's all pretty simple. You You can tell it's charging because a red light comes on at the back here, and when it's fully charged, the green light you can see comes on, and that's when the flash is ready to fire. Always check that the green light is on before trying to take a picture using the flash. Nothing bad will happen if it's not charged, it's just that you won't be able to take the picture. Here's a diagram from Polaroid showing how you should hold the camera when you're taking a photo. Basically, you place the fingers of your left hand over the top of the viewfinder, and your thumb under the camera. That's the method I prefer. It's really important so as to minimise camera shake, especially if it's windy. On the faceplate you have two important controls. On the right side there's a close-up slider that will give you an extra lens that allows you to focus a bit closer than usual. You still won't be able to get closer than 60 centimeters or 2 feet, but it's an important feature to have in mind. The standard minimum focus distance for this camera is 4 feet or 80 centimeters. The close-up lens just described is typically used for portraiture, and you can activate it by pushing the lever right across, like I've just done there. What happens is that the oval frame appears in the viewfinder, and you then have to just ensure that the person's head is fully within the oval frame before you take the shot, adjusting your distance as necessary so that it'll be in focus. It's a bit more complicated if the subject you want in close-up is a building or a small child or a group of people. You still use the close-up lens, but you can't use the oval frame to focus it. You just have to engage in trial and error, so it becomes a bit more tricky. When you're indoors or taking a night photo with a Polaroid, the flash range will vary, but it tends to be about 3 feet to 10 feet. In other words, closer than 3 feet and you risk overexposure, and farther than 10 feet and you risk underexposure. I'll be taking my photos in daylight, so we'll keep it nice and simple.
In simple terms, when you take a photo, what is happening mechanically is that you press the shutter button, which opens the aperture, which allows light to stream in. Exposure is the amount of light that reaches your film over a given period of time. Most cameras have a built-in light sensor to determine the correct exposure, and the light sensor here is built in, and it's at the front. It's called a photo cell. It's just here. I'll just call it the light sensor. The camera deduces the exposure from the light available in the scene, and in particular the light that falls onto the light sensor. This camera is comparatively primitive because it won't let me choose which part of the frame I want to expose for. By frame I mean the bit of the scene I'm shooting that I want to focus on. Instead, the light sensor at the front will set the exposure for whatever is directly in front of it. So if you have a very strong light source in the middle and the rest is much darker in comparison, the light sensor simply picks up this strong light source and exposes for it and neglects the rest, subject to other factors that I'm now going to touch on. If more light is present, the exposure is typically shorter and vice versa. That's pretty much common sense. But exposure is dependent on a number of other factors, not just the light available. It also depends on ISO. ISO means the sensitivity of a film to light. Colloquially, we call that film speed. Also aperture, which is basically the size of a hole in the lens, and a diaphragm within the camera varies the amount of light that can pass through the aperture. And another factor is shutter speed, which is basically the speed at which the camera takes a shot. Digital cameras allow you to change the ISO, but with a film camera like this one, the ISO is locked into the film. You can't alter that factor. The film for this camera, as I said, is Colour 600, a 640 ISO. That's quite fast, which helps with a limited aperture range. Since a Polaroid is basically a point-and-shoot camera, the camera will just pick these settings, the aperture, shutter speed for you, and as I say, the ISO is set by the film. Most automatic Polaroid cameras like this one use a combined aperture shutter mechanism that varies both the lens opening and the shutter speed. So in general, I'm going to assume that when using this camera, the brighter the light, the smaller the aperture and the faster the shutter speed. The exposure compensation slider will have an influence on exposure, so there's a manual element to how the Polaroid decides the exposure. It's not entirely automatic, but the slider is really more the compensator than a determinant, so putting the slider all the way to the light side, let's say, won't necessarily mean a maximum shutter speed. The camera itself does the work. What happens is that the camera decides the shutter speed based on the light available and using a set aperture range. It will then base the aperture within its available range on the distance to the subject. Let's say you're photographing someone up close. The camera will open up the aperture to aid what is called background separation, where the camera narrows its focus on the person you're photographing, which narrows the depth of field and gives you the person in focus and the background less in focus. A more open aperture can also have the opposite effect in that it can enable the background to be in focus and a nearer subject to be out of focus. On the other hand, let's say you're photographing some distant object or a landscape, then a larger depth of field is needed because the stuff you need to be in focus is further away, so the aperture narrows to enable more things in your picture to be sharp and in focus, albeit they may seem small. So depth of field can be defined as the area of the image that appears sharp, and this is determined by aperture. Aperture is measured in f-stops, and the measurement is a bit counterintuitive because the lower the f-stop, the larger the aperture. Every lens, or in this case where the lens is fixed, the camera itself, has a maximum and minimum range of aperture. The maximum aperture is more important than the minimum because it's a maximum aperture that sets how fast the camera's exposure is. A really large aperture range allows lots of light into the camera. Typically a fast lens would be an f-stop of 2.8 or below. Now this Polaroid CL635 has a maximum aperture of f14, which is slow, and that just reinforces that light is going to be a crucial factor when using this camera, and it may be given the time of year that I have to use the flash. At the other end of the aperture scale, what happens when you try to take a photograph of a landscape with a camera such as this is that the camera will often set to a fairly small aperture, and you end up with an effect called diffraction, in which the aperture set by the camera is too small and the picture is out of focus. This happens partly because it's a prime lens, meaning there's no zoom function and you have to either move closer to the object or rely on the close-up lens, which itself is limited, so there's no scope for narrowing of the aperture at distant objects to bring greater sharpness to a landscape photograph. Now, taking all that into account, it's pretty obvious that a Polaroid camera does have a number of technical limitations that are pretty much inescapable. There's no way to get all the parts in the picture correctly exposed since the dynamic range of a Polaroid film isn't very wide. There aren't many factors you can change as you might with a more sophisticated camera. This makes Polaroid photography tricky and means it's about knowing when not to take the shot as much as when to take the shot. The best approach is to focus on the part of the scene you want correctly exposed and be aware that the rest could be either overexposed or underexposed. One way of working around that is to avoid taking photographs with large differences in brightness, because even using the center exposure compensator setting on the slider at the front here, you otherwise end up with things that are not well lit that come out darker than they do to the human eye. On the other hand, if you select the dark exposure setting to grab the shadows, you lose a lot of colour saturation too. In other words, the natural look of colours, which is what makes a photo appealing. You'll never get anything near a perfect photo with this camera. What I like to do is turn the limitations into advantages by being artful, as I tried to do in the last video with the basic mobile phone camera. But here I'm not going to use any guile. I'm just going to try and take simple and honest street photos. It's winter, late winter, and what I'm planning to do is take a walk to the harbour and photograph whatever I see there, mainly people including tourists. Even out of season we get plenty of tourists here. I will have some problems. Part of the reason I'm doing this is as an experiment to see how the Polaroid will cope in cold winter. The cold is suboptimal for a Polaroid camera, so it will be interesting. Polaroid film works best in moderate temperature. The manufacturer, Polaroid themselves, say between 13 to 28 degrees C or 55 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit is the ideal temperature range, and they say that temperatures significantly outside of that range can affect the film in unpredictable ways with respect to development time, colour and saturation. We will definitely be below 13 degrees C, 50 or 55 degrees Fahrenheit when I get out in the morning, and a bit of research tells me that the problems seem to be that photos tend to emerge overexposed, lacking colour contrast and with an unattractive tint in those conditions. Some advice I found aimed at minimising the problems is that when shooting at lower temperatures, let your images develop in the inside pocket of your jacket or somewhere else close to your body, and carry your camera close to your body in order to keep the film pack and camera at a warm operational temperature. Apart from that, the opposite problem also pertains in that Polaroid film is very sensitive to bright light during the first few minutes of development. It's important to shield the photo from bright light immediately after it ejects from the camera and keep it in a dark place while it develops. I'll put mine in my pocket and then in a rucksack I'll have with me. The real problem at this time of year is a lack of light, a problem that will be exacerbated due to the technical limitations of the camera itself. The film for this camera, in common with all photographic film, is a chemical method of imaging which doesn't have the same sensitivity compared to something like a modern digital sensor. The camera itself, as I've explained, will also have a very small aperture too, so you really need lots of light for proper exposure, and I will need to make trade-offs. Polaroids, as a rule, need much more light than any other camera, digital or film. As such, my intention is to use the flash for every shot, unless there is a clear excess of light, and even then I may just use the flash anyway. I may come to regret that, we'll see, but there is another reason for using flash with a Polaroid, which is something called dynamic range. Photography is really fundamentally about light. A basic way of approaching a shot is to ask what is the range of brightest to darkest points in the same shot. Let's imagine that your eye can differentiate the whole scene in front of you as a range from a dark spot of 1 to a bright spot, say a bright window, as a 10. Your digital camera, even a phone, can do almost as well as your eye, and you can imagine for that device a range of 2 to 8. 35mm film would probably do 3 to 7, not as good as a digital, but decent. Instant film has the least range, only a few stops in an image. In this case, like, say, 4 to 6. In other words, Polaroid film has a very narrow dynamic range. That means it's not possible to have the same grade of exposure and details in bright and dark areas. This is a pretty unforgiving camera. So as a Polaroid photographer, it is your job to present the film with an image with most items in that 4 to 6 range, and because it's so limited, you need to focus as much as possible on items with similar lighting. This Polaroid 600 colour film has a narrow dynamic range of 3.5 stops, and this lack of nuance means that the camera needs even lighting to render all shades and highlights, and because that's not particularly realistic, it's likely that without the flash I'll lose detail in dark points such as shadows, if there are any, and in bright points and highlights. So using the flash, even though it'll be in daylight, is going to be pretty important for distances where the flash is active, typically 3 to 5 meters or 9 to 15 feet away from the lens, as that will help me fill the shadows and minimize underexposed areas. What I'm also going to try and do, where possible, is position my subjects in front of a solid background such as a wall if they're posing for me, or if they're not posing and it's spontaneous, then I'll try to capture them similarly against a wall or something like that. So my plan for the day tomorrow is that I'll go out in the middle of the day so it's as bright as possible. Ideally, when you're using a simple camera like this in winter, you want it to be a bright winter day. A bright day is forecast for tomorrow, and I'll go around at about midday, so that's going to be as bright as it can be. I'm not entirely sure how the auto exposure will compensate, but I'm going to assume a fairly slow shutter speed, which means I'll be taking photos of static things and people who are stood still or sat still. I hope in the context of buildings. I'll be looking for combinations of buildings or signs with people standing or sitting around. I'll set the camera to the centre setting for most of the shots and maybe experiment a bit with the light setting for a couple of shots, and it will be interesting to see how that turns out. One way of addressing the light problem with the Polaroid would be to choose a foggy or overcast day and focus on photographing people against plain or evenly lit backgrounds with no harsh shadows, as that helps you avoid over and under exposures, and you can probably manage without the flash for those types of scenes. The problem is that it's predicted to be a bright sunny day tomorrow. I think we're past the fog, we're in the clear skies part of winter and may not get much mist or fog until the early spring, so it will be tricky. There'll be lots of high contrast in between light and dark and lots of potential for error. I said I was going to use a flash. The flash on this camera does have its limitations. The effective range is only several feet in front of a camera, so any subject, anything or anybody that I'm photographing should be within that area. Beyond that, they will appear dark since the light decreases with distance. I know that's stating the obvious, but it's worth bearing in mind. The flash is not very powerful at all. This means that probably the biggest risk will be underexposure and coming away with dark photos. The flash will greatly help though. The exposure compensation slider I mentioned earlier is a pretty minor adjustment. It typically can't compensate for big differences in lighting. My next point is to consider the direction of my light source. This is very important. The light source is the sun, of course, because we're going to be outside, and the sun should preferably be behind me when I'm taking a photo. I try never to shoot directly into the sun. There are large buildings immediately on the harbour front which will affect the light, but at the same time there may well be a bright sun in the sky. The first thing I'll say is that it's a myth that you can get an instant photo from a Polaroid camera. Some of the photos took around a week to fully develop, and during that time I kept them in a shoebox in a warm part of the house. It's best to keep Polaroid photos warm during development. It was 8 degrees when I took the photos, which was not good for the camera, and some of the photos did come out with problems. Let me show you. The first photo I took was of a neighbour posing outside her brick outhouse. I think this turned out pretty well actually, maybe a bit underexposed, but that's probably unavoidable. I can't show you her face for reasons of privacy, but her face is well in focus. All the detail can be seen, and as you can in the rest of the picture, so that's a good one if I say so myself. The next one is at the harbour, and this is a man who runs a pirate boat excursions, or he has some involvement in it. The man was very nice and agreed to pose for the photo. It's not a good photo, unfortunately. I was relying on the centre setting and I used a flash. What I needed to do was stand a bit closer to him and slide the exposure compensator along the dark spectrum a little. Probably quite a lot of exposure compensation would have been needed, and I shouldn't have used a flash. I think the main problem is that I wasn't stood close enough to get his face in proper focus, and I was photographing in the direction of the sun, albeit there was some cover, so you can see the light distortion effect. This photo with the dog is okay, but would have been better if I just managed to take the picture a minute or so earlier when he was eating ice cream out of that cup you see there. But the camera jammed just as I was trying to get the picture, and it took me a minute or so to resolve the issue. The streaks you see there are called blue marks, and it may be the low temperature that causes that effect, but I'll discuss that in a few moments because that problem is on a few of these photos. The jamming of the camera may also be because of cold weather. This photo is of a statue on the harbour pier called the Gansey Girl. I'll put a link in the description if you want to find out more. A Gansey is a heavy woolen jumper often associated with fishermen, and the purpose of the statue is to pay homage to the families of fishermen. This is a good photo, I think. Maybe I could have narrowed the shot a little by moving a bit closer, and again you see the blue marks effect at the bottom there. I like this photo of the two men on the bench, but it's marred because I was again photographing into the sun. What I could have done was tone it down a little by not using the flash, because you see the effect of the overexposure. The exposure does have the positive effect in that it casts the two men in dark, which was intended, but it also introduces these light spots. Here's a lady with a dog and a baby. Not a bad picture at all, but again you've got the blue marks at the bottom, which we'll discuss in a few moments. Then you've got the seagull atop a litter bin. I like this one. It's got the blue marks effect again, as you'll see. You'll just catch a glimpse there to the right hand side of the dredger from my last video. I do really like this seagull photo. I think it's my favourite of them all because for me it captures the charm of these old Polaroids, that dreamy quality to the photo. Unfortunately, it looks like I needed to clean the lens at this point. I just didn't notice. This one is from the street that fronts onto the harbour and near the harbour master's office, and the effect there of the light streak of colour on the blue wall is due to a fault in the film. It's quite common to see that with Polaroids, unfortunately. Here's a dinosaur from a nice quaint little shop off a side street at the harbour. This one is of a shop along the harbour. Wouldn't be too bad, but the blue streak effect ruins it. Possibly I also needed to lighten it a bit to try and bring the sign above the shop into clarity, but there may be nothing I could have done about that. This one's self-explanatory. Seagulls are aggressive, good advice I think. This one of the shop again is a bit better. I like this one of the pirate. That's come out quite well, even if there are blue marks on the bottom. Another decent one, I took a walk along the West Harbour Pier to the dock where all the fishermen unload their catch, and I took this of two young fishermen unloading. Nobody seemed to mind me being there. The camera also jammed when I was trying to take a photo of a sea angler with his dog, which was a shame, as that would have been a great photo, but I did manage to get this one and I quite like it. It shows a sea angler right at the end of the Harbour Pier. You can see from those that I've had some of the issues I predicted, especially with overexposure and underexposure. The problem is that cold will affect photo development. The pictures may end up being too dark or too blue. As mentioned earlier, the white streaks you see there on the bottom of these photos are known as blue marks, and they could be for a number of reasons. It could be a fault with the film, but it's probably just due to the cold temperature. When the weather's warmer, I will probably go out and have another go at it.